How did artillery, specifically the Australian 9th Division's artillery, contribute to the victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein? Ladies and gentlemen, that was the sound of a battery of 25-pounders firing. They're actually 25-pounders from the Irish Defence Force on the last time that they were fired before they were retired. We're going to be hearing a lot more about the 25-pounder as we move from the cold and snowy Vimy Ridge to the Western Desert to a small railway stop called El Alamein, as we look at the employment of artillery in the Second Battle of El Alamein. This is part of our series commemorating 150 years of Australian permanent artillery. I wasn't really aware of the critical role that Australian artillery played in the Second Battle of El Alamein. I'm really glad that when I was looking at doing this series, I put it out to the gunner community and said, what should we be looking at? Nick Floyd suggested the 9th Division fire plan for Second El Alamein. And I'm glad that he did, because this is the apogee of artillery in the Second World War from an Australian point of view. Brigadier Ramsey, the CRA for the 9th Division, so the Commander Royal Artillery, he commanded at the peak 360 guns. By far the largest concentration ever given to an Australian artillery commander in the Second World War. He was given this many guns because Monty wanted to weight his main effort on the 9th Division as they played a critical role in the Second Battle of El Alamein. We're going to look at the battle in general, then we're going to look at the artillery battle, and then we're going to look at the lessons learnt from an artillery perspective. I'm also going to do a special episode on the deception plans that involved Second El Alamein, because this was fundamental to the success of the battle, and I think that there is a lot that we can learn about baking deception into the scheme of manoeuvre from the start rather than trying to bolt it on at the end. The resources for this series, we're going to be using The Development of Artillery Tactics and Equipment by Brigadier Pemberton. Now, this is a very detailed compilation of after-action reviews and lessons learnt from the employment of artillery from a British perspective in World War II. A lot of great lessons that were learnt, that were written down, and that have probably been forgotten for the conduct of Foundation warfighting today. We're going to be looking at Battle Winners by Alan Smith. I think this is Alan Smith's best book. Really interesting, details a lot of what went on from a 9th Div artillery perspective during the Western Desert Campaign, in particular Second El Alamein. The Gunners by David Horner, Do Unto Others, also by Alan Smith, Bailey's Field Artillery and Firepower. For the general overview, I've used Lieutenant General John Coates's Atlas of Australian Wars, an excellent reference for all of Australian battles. Lieutenant General Coates clearly and succinctly not only reports what happened, but also why it happened. And finally, Gunners at War by Shelford Bidwell. Now, in the introduction, he reminds the reader that during World War II, there were more gunners in the Royal Artillery than there were members of the Royal Navy. An interesting fact that highlights the importance of the role played by artillery during the Second World War. Now, a quick look at the timeline to see how things progress and lead up to the Second Battle of El Alamein. Firstly, we're going to look very quickly at the Battle of Gazala. This is the 26th of May to the 21st of June, 1942, and it leads to the Gazala Gallop. The 8th Army under Lieutenant General Ritchie, he's relieved of command on the 25th of June by Claude Auchinleck. He takes command personally of the 8th Army, so he's also the C&C of Middle East Command. On the 6th of June, strategically, we see Operation Blue, and this is the German attack into the Caucasus. We see the first Battle of El Alamein, the 1st to the 27th of July. The 8th Army, fighting under Claude Auchinleck, bring the German advance to a halt. El Alamein not being too far from Cairo, the logistics side, that certainly favours the Allies here. Rommel knows that he's got a very long logistics tail and he needs to either take Cairo quickly or he's going to have to withdraw. Rommel being Rommel, he's obviously very keen on taking Cairo. The 28th of August sees the Battle of Stalingrad commence. Then we've got the Battle of Alam al-Halfa. This is the 30th of August to the 5th of September. By this stage, Auchinleck's been sacked. Harold Alexander is now the commander of Middle East Command, and under him is Lieutenant General Montgomery in command of 8th Army. Alam al-Halfa is a strong defensive victory for the 8th Army. 7 weeks later, we see the Battle of El Alamein, and that lasts from the 23rd of October to the 11th of November. 3 days before the end of the battle, on the 8th of November, we've got the torch landings in Morocco and Algeria. November 19th to 23rd, in the Soviet Union, we see the launching of Operation Uranus, and that sees 300,000 Axis troops becoming encircled in Stalingrad. So we can see strategically, the picture is actually quite dire in the first half of 1942. By the end, it's looking a little bit more hopeful for the Allies. Second El Alamein represents the apogee of Australian artillery in the Second World War. Brigadier Ramsey, the Commander Royal Artillery for the 9th Division, commanded 360 guns at the peak of the battle. El Alamein would mark the last time an Australian division's organic artillery would or could be deployed to function as a whole, in concert with supporting elements, armour, engineer, signals, and the service resources, and providing an integrated artillery effect with the headquarters, field guns, anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft, and it was the last time they would be deployed in a major operation crucial to the outcome of the war. As we look at Second El Alamein, we're going to be looking for the principles of the employment of artillery. So they are cooperation, concentration of fire, economy of effort, and sustainment. And we're also going to be looking for examples of artillery tasks: suppression, neutralisation, destruction, harassment, illumination, interdiction, counter-battery fires, and the coordination of fires. Second El Alamein has all of these and in spades. It is, in many respects, particularly from an artillery point of view, a World War I battle. The tactics that Monty employed have not come a long way from the Western Front, but what has come a long way is the technology available to enact those tactics. And we'll see significant advances over the way that the war was fought in World War I, particularly in the way that command and control was managed. Prior to First El Alamein, artillery had been penny-packeted out significantly, and there was very little concentration of fires. First El Alamein would see a reversal of this trend, and Montgomery would continue that, really looking to concentrate the effect of the guns. And this will be extremely well illustrated by the fire planning that was conducted by Brigadier Ramsey, who was the Commander Royal Artillery of the 9th Divisional Artillery. The fire planning there would become a template for the British Army to use throughout the rest of the war, because it enabled the rapid development of fire plans that would support a manoeuvre element. It was Brigadier Sidney Kirkman who worked around reversing this decentralisation of artillery and bringing it all back into centralised command. He acted as Montgomery's Brigadier Royal Artillery during the Western Desert Campaign. In 1941, he'd run an exercise with the division that he was supporting on cooperation between infantry and artillery. Kirkman was an artillery staff officer during the First World War, so he was less concerned about technical gunnery, but much more concerned about artillery command and control, and how to achieve cooperation and, critically, that concentration of fire. At this seminar, Monty was quite impressed by what Kirkman said, and he added at the end that the role of the gunner CO, so the commanding officer of a gunner regiment, was to firstly train his regiment, and then to train the infantry brigadier to use the regiment properly. Kirkman had been an observer on Exercise Bumper, that this was an anti-invasion exercise that had been conducted in the UK, and it highlighted the fact that many officers did not have any experience in handling large numbers of men, nor large numbers of guns, and they were handing regiments over to brigades, which was counter to the principles of concentration. The desire to concentrate artillery had been lost, as had the mechanism to achieve it. In divisions, the Commander's Royal Artillery often decentralised their regiments, partly thinking that they were employing the lessons from the Battle of France, and partly because they were unable to effect command and control of their regiments. This lack of C2 meant that the counter-battery role was in a parlous state. Bidwell, in describing the impact of the Second Battle of El Alamein, wrote that for the first time since the false dawn of 1940, the army moved into the assault under the protection of carefully timed and controlled programs based on the best target intelligence. 12 days and 500,000 rounds later, and the Axis defences at El Alamein were finally broken. We can't have a second Battle of El Alamein without a first, and the first was brought on by the Battle of Gazala. Let's have a look at why the Battle of Gazala was such a debacle for the Allies. Desert warfare, particularly in the Middle East, was characterised by significant logistics issues. The further an army got from its logistics base, the harder it was to keep it supplied. Desert warfare was characterised by a victory, followed by an advance. That advance would then peter out as the logistics tail would struggle to keep up with the requirements to keep the army supplied. That would set the conditions for a defeat. That defeat would be the victory for the opposing side, which would then see it advance until its logistics tail culminated and brought on a defeat. The British were able to interdict Rommel's supply lines from Malta and with the Royal Navy, but the further that they advanced from Egypt, the more tenuous their logistics support became. Another issue that the British had was leadership at the top. Claude Auchinleck replaced Wavell in June 1941, following the failure of Operation Battle Axe to relieve the garrison that was besieged within Tobruk. So at this point, the Australian 9th Division is in Tobruk, but we're still more than 12 months before Second El Alamein. John Coates describes the issues of British commanders not being able to stamp their authority on their subordinates. He said that there was big differences in command, doctrine and training. The Germans led from the front, and the British High Command remained a well-meaning military democracy in which senior commanders continued to treat orders as a basis for discussion. The German doctrine was combined arms centred around the tank, but recognising the importance of the anti-tank gun for the offence and defence. General Jackson, who authored the Middle East volume of the British official history, wrote that the German superiority lay in their handling of tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery and infantry in closely knit teams. When their tanks met British tanks under unfavourable conditions, they withdrew through their anti-tank guns, drawing the British tanks into their fire. Their fundamental philosophy was to use anti-tank guns to kill tanks, tanks to kill infantry, and artillery to kill anti-tank guns and infantry. However, the British were wedded to the romance of cavalry charge and the tribalism of the corps systems. There was no centralised doctrine. In the end, everything hinged on the generals and ultimately on the Commander-in-Chief himself. Someone had to lay down a doctrine and then enforce it. Tactics couldn't be imposed by degree and acted on in mid-battle. And I think a really important question to point out here is that if the doctrine that the British were hoping to fight with was uncertain, then how was the training structured? Not for the individual soldier, not at platoon level, but at brigade and divisional level. Bidwell in Gunners at War has got an excellent description of this problem. Cooperation, which is the fruit of mutual understanding forged in the training which is the essential preliminary to a successful campaign, was destroyed by a command system which despised conventional formations and command channels and broke up formations as if they were composed of chessmen and not living soldiers with their prejudices and peculiarities and deep-rooted desire to be commanded at the moment of danger by a man they know. Admittedly, the apparatus of command was imperfect. The Royal Corps of Signals, without whom, of course, an army is like an animal without a nervous system, had suffered from starvation in the interwar years like everyone else, but the method of command seems to have degenerated into a series of discussions and visits. He goes on to describe the planning for Op Aberdeen, which was the 8th Army offence which was meant to finish off the Panzer Army. 4 days elapsed before Aberdeen was decided upon, and the commander of 5th Indian Division left one discussion believing some totally different operation was intended. The whole thing is inexplicable, and not the least inexplicable feature of it is the career of General Gott, who seemed to favour these methods, and in an era when commanders were regularly sacked, survived to be recommended for the command of the Eighth Army, having been worsted in almost every encounter that he had with the enemy. Everyone knows how all these extravagances ended with the arrival of Montgomery, and dull orthodoxy and military success was substituted for brilliant improvisation, confusion, heroism, and failure. The Battle of Gazala, which ran from the 26th of May 1942 through to the 21st of June, sees the town of Gazala, which is about 45 kilometres west of Tobruk, as the scene of an attack by the Panzer Army Africa under Erwin Rommel. And on the British side, we've got Claude Auchinleck as the Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command, and under him, 8th Army under Lieutenant General Ritchie. Rommel commences with a diversionary feint on the north or coastal edge of the British defences, whilst moving his main effort to the south of the British defensive line. However, they run into unexpected resistance from the Free French forces in the Bur Hakim box. This forced the Panzer Army Africa to move further around and create a very long supply line for them. They formed a defensive position which backed onto an Allied minefield. However, Italian engineers were able to lift the mines, and this created a significantly shorter supply route for them to be resupplied on. The British then executed Operation Aberdeen, which was their counterattack. However, it was poorly coordinated and the tanks were defeated in detail. They'd started the battle with around 300 tanks. This was reduced to 70 at the end of Op Aberdeen. The 8th Army conducted a withdrawal from the Gazala line in disarray. And there was confusion amongst the British commanders about the strategic intent for Tobruk. Gott, who was responsible for the defence of Tobruk, garrisoned it with 2 brigades of the 2nd South African Division under Major General Hendrik Klopper, along with a tank brigade, a motorised brigade, an infantry brigade, and an anti-aircraft brigade. Tobruk was surrounded, and the Panzer Army Africa was able to find a weakness in the defences on the eastern side of the city, through which they attacked, and the garrison fell in just 24 hours. 33,000 men were captured, many of whom had been on the western perimeter and had not fought. There was over 1,000 vehicles in working condition, 5,000 tonnes of food, and 1,400 tonnes of petrol. Just 4 months prior, Singapore had fallen. This was another devastating blow for Churchill. Rommel pursued the retreating British 8th Army across the Egyptian border, and it was only at El Alamein where the British were able to consolidate their defensive positions and check the Axis advance. So what went wrong? Pemberton wrote, "The hopes entertained at the beginning of this period had not been fulfilled. The superiority of 8-5 in artillery with which the 8th Army accepted battle on the 27th of May had failed to produce the results expected. Granted that tank for tank, the Germans were better armed, it generally was felt that our superiority in numbers, and in particular artillery, should have discounted this with proper handling. What had gone wrong? Committees and individuals debated this question at great length, and the reasons for failure were finally stated to be as follows. The dispersion of the artillery among small bodies, not under command of the highest artillery commander who could exercise collective control. The failure to make a fire plan based on adequate reconnaissance. The confusion in the minds of many gunners resulting from the dual role of the 25-pounder as a field and anti-tank gun. The improper use of anti-tank artillery, in particular of all that had been written and said on this subject, there were still far too many instances of anti-tank guns being knocked out through being fired portee when the situation did not justify it. And the difficulty experienced by the infantry under desert conditions of protecting the guns from close-range small arms fire. One of the attacks that the British made into the Cauldron had as a component of its fire plan the destruction of an Axis anti-tank screen. However, the location of that screen was incorrectly plotted in the fire plan, and as a result, the fires landed in the wrong location. As the British tanks came on in their assault, they were destroyed by the anti-tank guns. Using guns portee style refers to them being fired off the back of a truck. These are very quick to put them into action. However, they have a very high profile and it makes a much larger target. And particularly when you're up against a gun like the German 88, which is extremely long ranged and very accurate, being a high velocity weapon, that can be a critical failure. Tobruk fell on the 21st of June, and 4 days later on the 25th, Ritchie was sacked by Auchinleck. He took command personally of 8th Army. The next day, the 26th, began the Battle of Mercier-Matruh. 10th and 13th Corps under William Gott and William Holmes attempted to halt the Panzer Army Africa advance. However, their line of retreat was cut, but the Panzer Army Africa was too weak to stop their breakout. The British still had 200 tanks at this point, and the Germans only had 60 and the Italian 40 tanks. Auchinleck foresaw the risk of not being able to halt the Axis advance at Mercier-Matruh, and he was already preparing defensive positions at El Alamein. El Alamein is just 250 kilometres west of Cairo, and more importantly, 130 kilometres west of the strategically important port at Alexandria. El Alamein did not have a lot in the way of infrastructure to recommend it as a place for a defensive operation. In fact, it was only just a train stop with a couple of buildings around it. However, from the defensive point of view, the one thing that did create a significant opportunity for Auchinleck was the fact that there was a 30-mile gap between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression. The Qattara Depression, viewed by both the Axis and the Allies as impassable terrain. Falling back so far so quickly to El Alamein, however, created the flap in Cairo. And in fact, the 1st of July became known as Ash Wednesday in Cairo. And that was because of the amount of papers that the British government was burning in anticipation that Cairo was going to fall. It was said that on the streets of Cairo, you could buy a twist of peanuts with paper that was headed "Most Secret." However, what the British didn't know was that Rommel was very close to culminating. Logistics were becoming critical. The Battle of Mercier-Matruh would end on the 29th of June. Tragically for Auchinleck, the first Battle of El Alamein would start on the 1st of July. Auchinleck may have understood the problems that were leading to the defeats of the 8th Army, but he was given no time whatsoever by Rommel to be able to make those adjustments to doctrine. He would be creating a defence out of ad hoc units, and in fact Bidwell, in Gunners at War, describes the fruit salad-like order of battle for the Royal Artillery. This was because formation titles meant little in this period. Whole regiments were missing, armoured regiments down to a few tanks, battalions to companies. Rommel's pursuit to Alamein was by a force of some 50 tanks, and his divisions were some 1,000 strong. Rommel commenced his attack at 0300 on the 1st of July, with the 90th Light Infantry Division advancing. Much of the fighting focused around the Wisat Ridge. However, stubborn defences, including concentrated artillery fires, thwarted Rommel's attempts to break through. Not only that, but the Desert Air Force was now having an increasingly large impact on the battle. They had achieved air superiority over the battle, and on the 4th of July they were able to conduct 900 sorties, both in support of the battle as it was being conducted and on the long logistics tail that Rommel was relying on to keep his forces supplied. Not only were his logistics being attrited on land, but his convoys were also being sunk at an alarming rate. In June, he only received 4,500 tonnes of supplies compared to 31,000 tonnes in May. He notified the German High Command that he would need 2 weeks to reorganise before posturing again for his next offensive. On the 4th of July, the Australian 9th Division started entering the north of the defensive position. 30th Corps had a new commander, Lieutenant General William Ramsden, and on the 8th of July, Auchinleck ordered him to capture the low ridges at Tel el Eisa and Tel el Eisa. The Australian 26th Brigade was given the job of assaulting Tel el Eisa, including Trig 33. Their attack commenced at 0330 on the 10th of July with the heaviest bombardment that had been conducted in the Western Desert up until that point. They were supported with tanks of the 44th Royal Tank Regiment, which they had under command. Their enemy were Italian troops from the 60th Infantry Division, Sabratha. They had only just occupied hastily improvised defences, and these troops were quite inexperienced, so the barrage created a large amount of panic within their ranks. The Australian attack routed the Italian division, 1,500 prisoners were taken, but most importantly, they captured the German Signals Intercept Company 621. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot more in our episode on deception, because this is a significant development that would have repercussions across the theatre. That afternoon and night, elements of the 15th Panzer Division and the Italian Trieste Motor Division counterattacked. However, these counterattacks were repelled with overwhelming Allied artillery and the Australian anti-tank guns. The next day, the 2nd 24th Battalion, along with elements from the 44th Royal Tank Regiment, attacked the western end of the Tel el Eisa hill, which was point 24. And by early afternoon, that feature had been captured and held against a number of counterattacks. Meanwhile, Auchinleck was developing Operation Bacon, and this was to be an attack on the Italian 17th Infantry Division, Pavia, which was in front of Reshaped Ridge. Auchinleck assessed the Axis critical vulnerability as being the Italian divisions. He assessed their morale to be lower, and the Germans would be unable to hold the entire front without the Italian troops, so he would go after the Italian troops where he could find them. It was to be the Italian troops of the 17th Infantry Division, Pavia, who would be the target of the First Battle of Reshaped Ridge. This attack would be conducted by the 4th and 5th New Zealand Brigades, with 2 Armoured Brigades in support. The attack became disorganised by mines and elements of enemy who'd been left behind. This made it difficult to bring up supporting logistics and, importantly, artillery elements. Armoured reinforcements became stuck in minefields. They were attacked by the 8th Panzer Regiment, which was able to knock out their anti-tank guns, and they were exposed in the open and they had no alternative to surrender. 350 New Zealanders were taken prisoner. Rommel rushed German troops to support the wavering Italian defenders, and this time it was the 4th New Zealand Brigade that was on the receiving end of a sharp counterattack. Their anti-tank defences were destroyed and 380 New Zealanders were taken prisoner. This included Captain Charles Upham, who was to be awarded a 2nd Victoria Cross for his actions in the battle that day. At 1800, the brigade headquarters was overrun by the German counterattack. 3 days of fighting had seen the Allies take 2,000 Axis prisoners, mainly Italians. The New Zealand division suffered 1,405 casualties. However, the fighting at Reshaped and Tel el Eisa had caused the destruction of 3 Italian divisions and had forced Rommel to deploy his armour and lay minefields in front of the Italian divisions. Auchinleck then ordered Australian 9th Division to attack Materia Ridge, or as they knew it, Ruin Ridge. And in the early hours of the 17th of July, the 24th Brigade, supported once again by the 44th Royal Tank Regiment, and strong fighter cover, assaulted Ruin Ridge. The night attack went well. Over 700 Italian prisoners were taken. However, vigorous Axis counterattacks forced the Australians to withdraw with over 300 casualties. This was followed by the Second Battle of Reshaped Ridge. Auchinleck was hoping to capitalise on his material advantage. 1st Armoured Division now had 173 tanks, with more in reserve. This included 61 of the Grant tanks. Rommel was now down to just 38 German tanks and 51 Italian tanks. The Kiwis attacked on the night of the 21st of July, and whilst they were initially successful, follow-on forces were unable to get to them, so they were left in an exposed position without support arms. 2 armoured brigades, which were meant to sally out and support them, were unable to get there due to anti-tank fire and mines. The next morning, they were counterattacked and they took more than 900 casualties. Meanwhile, the Indian 161st Brigade had tried to clear the western end of Rawissat. 23rd Armoured Brigade was meant to support them. The commander of their parent formation, 1st Armoured Division, Major General Gatehouse, was unsure if the path had been cleared of mines or not, and he wanted the attack cancelled. However, the Corps commander, so this is 13th Corps, Lieutenant General William Gott, rejected this and ordered the attack to go in, but on a different line of advance. This one hadn't been cleared. He mistakenly believed that it had. That order didn't get through. However, the original line of advance was also still mined. The brigade was delayed in the minefield, found itself under heavy anti-tank attack, and was then counterattacked by 21st Panzer. The 23rd Armoured Brigade was destroyed. It had lost 40 tanks and had 47 badly damaged. On the 22nd of July at 0600, the Australian 26th and 24th Brigades attacked. The 26th towards Tel el Eisa and the 24th towards Tel el Alamein toward Ruin Ridge. It was during this attack that one of the companies of the 2nd 48th Battalion became bogged down with a series of machine gun posts less than 100 yards in front of them. Grasping the seriousness of the situation and without hesitation, Private Gurney charged the nearest machine gun post, bayoneted 3 men and silenced the post. He then continued onto a second post, bayoneted 2 men and sent a third as a prisoner. At this stage, a stick grenade was thrown at Private Gurney, which knocked him to the ground. He rose again, picked up his rifle and charged a third post using the bayonet with great vigour. He then disappeared from view and later his body was found in an enemy post. That's part of the citation for the Victoria Cross that he was awarded for the actions on that day. 24th Brigade had the 50th Royal Tank Regiment in support. However, they had not been trained in conducting a combined arms assault with infantry. Because of that, the infantry and the armour advanced independently, and when they reached the objective, the 50th Royal Tank Regiment lost 23 tanks because there was no infantry support to suppress the anti-tank fire. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority that the 8th Army had, they were unable to destroy the Panzer Army Afrika. However, Rommel reported that his situation was critical in the extreme. On the night of the 26th-27th of July, Auchinleck launched Operation Manhood, which was a combined attack between the 24th Brigade, the Australian 24th Brigade, and the 69th Infantry Brigade. This was the third attack and completely expected attack on Ruin Ridge. The infantry would have moved through, capture their objectives, clear lanes for the tanks, and then the 2nd Armoured Brigade would pass through. They would then be followed by the 4th Light Armoured Brigade, which would achieve the breakthrough and then commence attacking the Axis lines of supply. The attack, like many of the others, was rushed and poorly planned. The British and Australian infantry brigades were able to achieve their objectives. However, anti-tank units that were following on were lost in the darkness, delayed in minefields, which meant that both of the infantry brigades were unsupported when daylight came. 50th RTR was unable to find the gap in the minefield. They were meant to be supporting the Australians. The 69th Brigade was overrun by the German counterattack. They took 600 casualties. The 2nd 28th Battalion, they had 500 troops who were forced to surrender. Only 90 men got away, and they would form the nucleus of the battalion that was to be rebuilt. The 8th Army, despite its numerical superiority in materiel and men, had fought itself to a standstill. Auchinleck, demonstrating his intellect, conducted an appreciation on the 27th of July. He surmised that it would be at least 2 weeks before the 8th Army would be ready to attack. However, he also believed that Rommel knew this, that the logistics battle was going to be won by the Allies, and therefore this would force Rommel to strike. Auchinleck, therefore, commenced preparing for a defensive battle. Leslie Morshead, the general commanding the 9th Division, or Ming the Merciless as he was known, wrote on the 29th, "The barometer of the 8th Army has been oscillating wildly ever since our arrival. No stability, a wealth of plans and appreciations, fighting always in bits and pieces and so defeats in detail. formation being broken up automatically. It has been difficult and unpleasant keeping 9th Division intact. Of this action, Bidwell, in Gunners at War, wrote, "This was the last action of its kind between 25-pounders and tanks in the desert. It was also the end of an extraordinary chapter in British military history in which unorthodoxy reigned supreme, with the most disastrous results. Tactics is really rather a dull subject, except for professional tacticians, and its laws are sets of platitudes. But if ever the truth of these platitudes was given a costly demonstration, it was in the period between the beginning of the battle axe operation in the summer of 1941 and Auchinleck's stand at El Alamein. It was not merely a question of misusing the artillery, it was part of a wider malaise. Instead of concentration, there was extreme dispersion, which cannot be accounted for attributing it to Liddell-Hartism or any other theory. It seems to have grown out of the habit of planning from a small-scale map. Nothing is more deceptive than these coloured ovals and arrows unchecked by the measurement of times and distances and a look at the ground. It made control almost impossible. On the battlefield, demanding the utmost mobility, the brigades were locked up in defensive localities. The Guards Brigade group, having been fully motorised and converted into Panzer Grenadiers, were told off to garrison the Knightsbridge box and to send their transport away. In August, Churchill, on his way to meet with Joseph Stalin in Moscow, accompanied with General Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, visited Cairo. In the last 6 months, he had suffered Malaya, Force Z, Burma. The Germans were advancing relentlessly in Russia. On the 1st of July, Churchill was the subject of a no-confidence vote in Parliament. It was defeated 475 to 25 in favour of the Churchill government. However, the fact that it had even been brought about showed the deteriorating political position in which Churchill found himself. Auchinleck was sacked and Harold Alexander was to take command of Near East Command. Command of the 8th Army would go to William Strafer Gott. Field Marshal Sir Michael Carver, who had served under Gott, said that he was the one person to whom all, high and low, turned for advice, sympathy, help and encouragement. But he also believed that Gott was too good a man to be a really great soldier. And Gott himself expressed to Alan Brooke that he was the wrong man for the task. But, if required, he would do it. Gott was a big man, aggressive, outgoing, and Churchill liked him. However, Brooke was not convinced. Brooke thought that he'd tried most of his ideas on the Boche, and that Brooke said that we want someone with new ideas and plenty of confidence in them. Gott was tired and had lost his drive, having been in the desert since the start of the war. However, it was Churchill's role to appoint the army commander, and that's what he did. I did say earlier that the Desert Air Force had achieved air superiority, not air supremacy. On the 7th of August, a Bristol Bombay from No. 216 Squadron was shot down by a Messerschmitt Bf 109. Both engines stopped, and the pilot, 19-year-old Flight Sergeant Hugh Jimmy James, managed to make a successful crash landing. However, the two Messerschmitts strafed the disabled plane, and all of those unable to escape were killed. This included Lieutenant General Gott. Reading about the Second Battle of El Alamein, many accounts talk about Montgomery coming in to command of 8th Army. Not many of the accounts mention the fact that he was Churchill's second choice. We're going to leave the story here. Next, we're going to come back and look at deception. Then we're going to study how Montgomery was able to turn around the doctrine, the tactics, and the morale of the 8th Army, because that's a fascinating story. Then we'll look at the employment of artillery, particularly 9th Divisional artillery, at the Second Battle of El Alamein.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.